Hi, my name is Maya. I'm really excited to present to you today, Securing Tomorrow, a deep dive into ZK for automated regulatory compliance. This is going to be a workshop, so I'm going to have you guys do a few exercises and activities, and I know it's the last presentation of the day, so please feel free to ask questions as we go along. It's going to be the least technical presentation at ZK11, I so hope. So feel free to give your technical mind a break and embrace the world of regulation, law. Right, without further ado, welcome. Law and regulation. Crypto and blockchain is a subversive technology. Ideally, we're building a new financial paradigm that does away with a lot of central tenets that make up key financial institutions and that governments then leverage in order to, control populations. So there's naturally going to be apprehension when we're talking about, hey, we should listen to what regulators have to say. Because so far, financial regulations have been, iffy, questionable. We've had laws passed like Dodd-Frank and other regulations after the 2008 financial crisis that a lot of us believe haven't addressed a lot of key issues. And so we're building something new. But, this is the overview of the presentation. I'm going to kind of walk you guys through why we should care, what the regulatory landscape is looking like with an examination of some key regulations, the intersection of zero-knowledge proofs with compliance, with automated compliance. Gonna have you guys do an exercise at the end, progress and future directions, including regulations that are coming up the pipeline, and the applicability of those regulations to what we'll be building. And I think then we'll be good to wrap it up. Okay. Sec. Okay. So, introduction. Guys, they're onto us. They know what's up. We're going to examine the general data protection regulation that EU lawmakers have come up with, but there's really no point in saying lawmakers don't know what they're talking about and they can't touch us. They do, and they have research groups dedicated to examining issues of compliance in a blockchain and the intersection with blockchain technology. Increasingly, data privacy issues and potential mitigation strategies are being researched. And, decentralized technologies are really being viewed as the future of technology compliance, right? Distributed technologies are spreading, so are devices. The blockchain technology cloud market size is forecasted to be worth nearly $1 trillion by 2030. It's starting to pose an existential threat to some financial institutions, especially in developing countries. But moreover, as blockchains store private information and relay private information, including about the actors that interact with them, it's piquing the interest of lawmakers because suddenly our interactions fall under the scope of different laws. There are also more phones than there are people worldwide, and that's just continuing to increase. The more devices that there are, the more that we interact digitally, the more we're going to spend our lives in these digital worlds, the more we're going to have to take one another into account and play nicely. And so far, there are enforcement agencies that come into play. So more people than ever interacting with one another through smart devices, blockchains and on-chain transactions are growing at a rapid pace. And as blockchains spread, so will their applications and the apps on them. You know, we're going to be spreading financial history, credentials, and disseminating on-chain activities. Who else cares about financial history, credentials, financial transactions? Governments and regulators. Guys, it's coming, it's here. And here's why we should align, right? Yeah, governments for the longest time haven't really played nicely, but they are there to enforce some, values that we can all rally behind, like privacy, security, sovereignty, and verifiability, truth-telling. They're also interested in, enabling more complex and secure applications for people to interact with one another and for governments to interact with their citizens. How many of us have been victims of bureaucracies, DMVs, and so on? Also, finally, bad actors do exist. Money laundering is a serious problem that, blockchain mitigates, but increasingly on-chain activity is going to be made up of social apps and other more complex applications, and we want to keep one another safe, especially as we start to tie our financial history with our online activity. Market opportunity. Compliance is a $13 billion business in Europe alone, and programmable compliance spreads across systems from blockchains to enterprise solutions. If you bring enterprises on board, multi-billion-dollar companies, you're going to foster blockchain adoption, and that's going to lead to the development of more fun stuff, right? There's more value in the ecosystem. Everybody needs. Finally, if the carrots weren't enough, there are fines. Regulators are really cracking down on tech companies for breaching data privacy laws and regulations. I'm going to point to this one excerpt that the unstoppable force GDPR has compelled companies to comply with new data privacy regulations if they want to do business in the European Union. Compliance with GDPR is not optional, since violations can result in colossal penalties of up to 20 million euros or 4% of global revenue, whichever is greater. If you're running nodes in the European Union, you are going to fall under GDPR. And right now, they're not necessarily going after the little guy, but the little guy is growing. And the little guy is starting to perform more complex operations and bring on board more complex data. Which leads us to a regulatory landscape overview, right? That's kind of the primer. Privacy laws are decentralized too. As you can see, in all of these countries, just about, someone is running a node, someone is mining Bitcoin, someone is mining Ethereum. In all of these countries as well, there are privacy laws. And as you can see by the coloration, they vary from heavy to robust to moderate to limited. But as citizens begin to spend more time online, this doesn't really show the temporal axis. But at first, what was really red was just Europe. And the US, relatively given HIPAA. But the stringency has been spreading across Asia, across Latin America, and every single year, more countries pick up on cues of other countries. As you're starting to deal with global dissemination of information, the bar should be to comply with the heaviest regulations, because those are going to be the regulations everywhere eventually, and you don't really want to be tracking the IP addresses of the people running your tech. Right, so this is actually a really great overview of the different regulatory, laws in the U.S., in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and Africa. And we'll be honing in on a few of these, but just wanted to demonstrate that, right, more and more countries are also going to start stipulating data residency laws. So that means wherever data resides, and if it enters the border of a country, it is going to fall under the scope of said country. Right, so any questions so far? Any questions? All right. In that case, let's look at some key regulations. So, GDPR. GDPR offers the most comprehensive protection of data rights within the EU, right? And here are some key premises that we're going to become familiar with as they apply to a blockchain context, right? So, how do you start to regulate data? Well, first, you're going to need a subject that is going to be able to be held liable and, is going to interact with the regulatory body. In this case, that's the data controller. And that's who subjects address to enforce their rights. Traditionally, a data controller can be something like Meta, can be something like Google, and it has been for the longest time. Next, we have data erasure. GDPR stipulates that you and you and you and you have the right to delete and erase any of the data that you don't want out there. Just because you give someone your data doesn't mean that you can't say, hey, erase it, and they have to comply. Additionally, personal data should be amendable, so it should be changeable. Then there's minimal data processing, which means there is a minimal handling of data. This really stipulates that whenever a data controller has your data, they should not be performing excessive and egregious operations on it. Here, you can have a relative and an absolute view, right? So an absolute view is any operation over my personal data that I do not consent to, for instance, computation over it, encryption over it, is excessive. Then you have a relative view of, look, actually, when I hand over my data, I agree to its encryption and I agree to its management, but the lines are a little blurred. Who knows how much consent I give beyond that point. Finally, there are requirements around cross-border transfer. So if you are transferring data into Europe or outside of Europe, or between different organizations, you have to comply with certain regulations, including, disclosure of data being transferred across borders. And if you have incoming data into the European Union, it also has to fall under the scope of GDPR, so it has to be compliant. So something very similar is modeled in the US, which is the CCPA, and that is comprehensive data protection in California. Other US states are following suit. Again, there's kind of a domino effect with stringent regulation spreading across the world. And the key premises here are kind of in line with the GDPR. So consumer rights, you have the right to know what personal information is being collected, sold, or shared, and the right to access personal information. Data erasure, data security requirements. Businesses must implement reasonable security measures to safeguard consumer personal information against data breaches, and disclosure for cross-border data transfer. So, as we can see, while GDPR and CCPA are independent, we start to see concurrent themes emerging. So, right, these key points, one data point, data erasure, are here to stay. Right? Now, when we think about compliance in a blockchain context, suddenly all of that is flipped on its head. Instead of one controller, we have joint controllers, many players, many different people running many different blockchain nodes and running different protocols. Where you earlier had data erasure, now you have immutability. Guys, we have a permanent record, and it's here to stay. Where you had minimal processing, you have data replication and processing on different computers. And if earlier you had to, play careful when transmitting data across borders, we've finally allowed for seamless cross-border transfer of information, including financial information. Now, this may vary between private and public blockchains, right? We can argue that actually we can limit some of this, right? Instead of joint controllers, maybe we have two agreed upon parties. Maybe instead of immutability, we have selective erasure. And all of that can really take off on private blockchains. But bringing the next billion users on board is possible through public blockchains. And, going back to the values list, we want to increase the sovereignty of individuals. So we're going to be dealing mainly with public blockchains. So this brings us to our first activity. Guys, this is what we're up against. On the top, we have regulation. On the bottom, we have the blockchain context. Now, I'm going to ask you guys to come up with, in at least 3 of these circles, and I'll pass around the mic, ways that zero-knowledge proofs could potentially promote synergies. So, for instance, I'll throw one out for data erasure. What if we could have zero-knowledge proofs verifying that data was erased or certain blocks were erased in a blockchain, right? Or that within data servers, certain information has been erased, and we can generate a proof of that without revealing the private or confidential information. So that is one workaround. But okay, I'm gonna set a timer for like a minute and see what you guys come up with. Right? Yeah, feel free to talk to one another and so on. Yeah, like turn to the person sitting to your left, right, to your right. Yeah. Alright. Few more seconds and then I'll pass the mic around. Guys, I'm going to pass the mic around. Oh, yay. Okay, perfect. So let's start from this side of the room and then go on.
We just had social hour.
Oh, okay.
We really enjoyed it.
Yay.
So I don't have something with those circles, but one comment I will make. Oh, I don't know. One comment I will make is you said at the beginning that regulators know their stuff. And what was really interesting to me is I'm Canadian and I met with all the Canadian regulators right after FTX collapsed as a way to like show a tech forward positive face to regulators as they tried to pretty much destroy us. Not only do they know all of this stuff, one of the regulators told me that she just built a Uniswap trading bot just to play around with it. Like they're even building.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we reached any definitive conclusion or whatever, but as one thought I had in terms of data erasure and immutability, I'm not thinking of it in terms of having data actually be removed from public ledgers, because I think more importantly is that whatever data is there is unusable, like for example in perfectly hiding manners using commitments or something like that, so that even if it's public forever, it's unusable in a sense, something like that.
Yeah, I had a very similar thought, but a variation on it, which is that even if you encrypt your data, you shouldn't post the ciphertext on-chain. Instead, you should post an ephemeral encryption key on-chain and rotate the key frequently. And this pattern provides you forward secrecy in the sense that if your encryption key is ever exposed, then in the first case, all your ciphertext would become plain text. But in the second case, it wouldn't matter because you would have already moved to a fresh encryption key.
So I was a bit surprised about the one-sided focus on like data privacy regulation. Do you have any thoughts on, like, for example, antitrust regulation that affects sensitive information shared by businesses? And the second comment, I feel that getting the highest level of privacy is not so much the issue anymore. So we have Zcash, we have Tornado Cash. I think the real issue is that regulation also has another side that demands a lot of accountability and transparency, like AML, CFT, Basel III, some liquidity requirements on exchanges. And I feel that the clash is that the regulators, they don't give a constructive idea on how to solve this apparent conflict between, on the one side, you need to hide the data, and on the other side, they need the data to verify that you're compliant. And I think it's exactly this tension where ZKPs can help, although it's not always completely clear where you put the balance.
Yeah, totally. That's coming up. So we will talk a little bit about Zcash and AML and KYC as well. But this is kind of like just an exercise for how ZKPs can offer some synergies, right? Because, like, look, this is a pretty broad problem that eventually all chains are going to have to run up against when it comes to handling data. Like, this is a fundamental problem, especially if we're then talking about KYC and AML, right? To have KYC and AML on chain, we're going to have to bring private identity credentials on chain. And once you bring them on chain, if I can make the case that you are running my passport information through joint controllers in a way that I can't ask you to erase it through your decentralized replication and processing, blockchain, while sending it all over the world, I have a pretty strong case that you're in violation of GDPR, you're in violation of CCPA, and I can prosecute you. Right now, lawmakers haven't really gone that route because so far financial transactions have been coursing through blockchains, not so much personal identifiers. But exactly to your point, we're entering an era where all of this information is going to start flowing through blockchains, and even more with data. And if we're talking about, on-chain compute and on-chain AI and on-chain ML, that's even going to be more data rich. And yeah, so these are some things I was thinking, like, right, ZKP is a data erasure. Maybe we could have light clients and ZKPs of light clients that minimize data replication, data processing, and we could also play nicely, and maybe someone could build something like this, a compliance, verification protocol for cross-border transfers that has to do with pinning GPS coordinates. That's all doable.
Maybe one question on the ZKPs of data erasure. So, what exactly do you understand under that? So, I would say that proving that I deleted something from my file system is impossible. But what I can do, and what I've seen also published, is that you can retrospectively remove data from a block and insert instead a proof that removing this does not affect any future transaction, because if you remove a receipt of a spent UTXO, then this is obviously something that tampers with the current state as well. But you can, if it's about, for example, identity data that you just use to prove some authorization, then basically this does not necessarily remove something that affects the current state anymore. And therefore you can bridge this evident gap that you get in the hash links through a zero-knowledge proof that whatever you removed is not problematic.
Yes, that exactly.
Okay.
That would be the practical implementation. I'm not going to go too much into but and your name is? Hannes. Exactly what Johannes said. Right, because that's how you do it. So ZKP's intersection with compliance. This is now the field that we're in. And here, we're going to start talking about key financial regulators. And as we're talking about them, we're going to hone in on the U.S. because, as earlier said, whatever the stringent regulation is, other countries tend to follow. That is generally the trajectory. And the U.S. is kind of the center of the world for capital markets at the moment. We're changing. Right. So OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And their key premises is you have the right to know your customer, and you should know your customer before engaging in transactions with them. So imagine that me and Turan are about to, sell a backpack. Or Turan is saying, I'm going to sell you a backpack. If that backpack turns out it has like explosives in it, I can't say, I didn't know. Or if it turns out Turan was like blacklisted and I've done business with him, I have to know my customer. And so, we're going to have to start thinking about bringing, interacting with data sets that contain personal information, including blacklists. Next, we have anti-money laundering, going back to the backpack. Now, what if I say, hey, Turan, look, it's really hard for me to get rubles right now. Could you stuff that backpack with rubles? Except the rubles maybe is an on-chain transaction, and he's purposefully trying to launder money out of the country, or let's say out of a business. That falls in scope, and that would be prosecuted by these agencies. Illicit finance mitigations, so anything you can think of from theft and other illicit activities, prevention of unlawful actors from accessing funds, customer due diligence, and all of this in line with data protection regulations. So we're building off of this to get to now what the regulators expect to prosecute bad actors. Meanwhile, we also have something else that regulators are really caring about. So on the finance side, right, we're talking KYC AML. On the health side, and also treatment of sensitive information. One of the best kind of bodies of regulation out there is HIPAA. And HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Now, its key premises are protection of medical records, securities and identifiers rules. So all of this is kind of talking about securing personal identifiable information. And this is also highly enforceable. So, finance, KYC AML, sensitive information protections. Right. So you have rights for how your data is used. And then we get to ZKPs. And look, they're offering private verifiability of data and private verifiability of operations conducted on the data, which can enable gated access to data in line with things like HIPAA that seek to protect sensitive information, in line with, let's say, databases of blacklists that governments have that can now, let's say, you can generate a proof someone is on a blacklist without necessarily revealing the contents of the blacklist. Selective disclosure of data and the anonymization of actors. There's a tension, right? So as much as it can help, at the same time, privacy kind of stands in the way of transaction monitoring and maintaining customer records. It's a case study. A good case study for this is Zcash, which illustrates both the pros and the cons. So Zcash came under US and EU and international scrutiny when it turns out that it was violating AML and KYC and enabling money laundering through its private transactions. This is a case that lawmakers ended up making, that by obfuscating the privacy of the individuals interacting with one another on the network, Zcash was promoting money laundering. This is kind of how it's being looked at now, and increasingly how more and more ZK roll-ups and ZK chains may be scrutinized. Right. And it added a compliance burden for Zcash companies operating in multiple jurisdictions. So applications aren't really safe here either. If you have a tension between privacy, maintaining customer records and transaction monitoring, maintaining customer records and transaction monitoring have to be factored in. Otherwise, you will end up in Zcash's shoes. So, in blockchain contexts, people are really thinking about this and saying, okay, so how do we maintain access for regulators? How do we make sure that we're not enabling money laundering and that only verified persons are interacting with one another? This is actually a great breakdown of a privacy protocol that was implemented and more to follow suit. So you can say that funds can be deposited if funds are not from a sanctioned address, from an address that received the funds from a regulated financial intermediary. Meanwhile, funds can be withdrawn if they're not from a sanctioned address, or from a sanctioned address and the transaction is anonymized, or from an address that received the funds from a regulated financial intermediary. The question is, where do the lists of sanctioned addresses live? How do we have access to them, right? These are great questions to ask. Potentially, a synergy that could be had is, governments and regulators ultimately hold on to those databases, and we can request proofs before interacting with, let's say, someone who wants to transact on a certain chain that, they're not on the list. But this requires coordination between different identity protocols and synchronization with regulators. So hopefully, if anyone's going to Washington or to other regulatory bodies, we can start to ask questions about, look, actually, we can build these privacy protocols, but we want to make sure we're not on the hook for sanctioned addresses. How can we work with you? Right. The other thing that we really can't shake our head at is say, whatever, fines can and will be imposed if this is ignored. So just keeping that in the top of our minds. Also, if we're thinking about holding on to sensitive information, such as databases of, let's say, blacklisted individuals, a concern here is civil resistance, right? If we're not implementing like a joint controller approach, and we're thinking about how can we minimize a certain vector of attack, and how can governments likewise minimize a vector of attack if they're going to be sending out further information. I think a very solid solution is government agencies sending proofs to blockchains and other entities that request them. Which brings us to, right, so to achieve privacy protocols, we need identity information to interact with blockchains. We need proofs of personhood, right? So in order to make sure that you're a person, you are who you say you are, I'm not on the hook for laundering money with Turan. How do I make sure Turan is who he says he is? And let's say after I've gotten the proof back from the government that Turan is not on any blacklist that they might have, how do I know that Turan is a person without revealing his personhood? So there are several ways. There's biometric verification, and WorldCoin is really a pioneer with this, where they have biometric verification. The data is collected about your irises. A hash is generated from that. It's a unique identifier. The iris information is deleted. You go on with your day. Another potential is demonstrations of human-like activity on social media or on-chain. right? So we can generate proofs that, oh, this, these interactions or this interaction with the graph corresponds to a unique person. And as artificial intelligence grows more advanced, this is going to be more looked into. Right now, like, a good example is Gitcoin and Gitcoin Passport, that when you link your Twitter to it, they're analyzing it for human-like activity to say, yeah, good to go, this looks like a reasonable follower count, this is probably a person. Social media are on chain. And finally, we can have proof generation on device-side data, right? So we all use Face ID, or if we have Androids, maybe we tap our fingers, or the phone interacts with us enough. Maybe we can generate proofs of personhood on the device side. So I have a few problems with biometric verification, right? If you're just storing the hashes, there's a case to be made first that it's not truly decentralized, right? They actually have a certain database that stores these iris hash functions that makes it vulnerable to maybe a Sybil attack. And as quantum computing takes off, quantum computing promises to eventually be able to kind of reverse engineer those hashes. All of this is potential, right? Some argue no, but these are some theories.
No hashes. Asymmetric encryption, definitely, but hashes are not reliable.
Right. Well, I'll take the point, but we'll see. Also, absolute versus relative legal approaches, right, as to data processing. Even though this doesn't necessarily correspond to personal information, there is a case to be made that they are still processing, even as the hash, or your biometric information. When it comes to social media and demonstration of human-like activity, here we have questions of accuracy and verifiability of models for congruence, right? Because I can say, yeah, I'm running a model, and it tells you with 99% accuracy that this is a person. We're probably going to want to have like a certain standard for those types of models. We're going to want to verify that they're doing what they say they do. And it seems like proof generation on device-side data is really the way to go. Again, there are more devices than there are people. Our devices are what we interact with every day. And there are increasing ways, even through zero-knowledge virtual machines, through other proof generation mechanisms to securely generate a proof of data contained on your phone. Another bonus point is proof of humanity. Now, this is a novel approach where people vouch, like verified people that somebody saw and said, these are people, say, oh, this is also a person. And you start to have this network of people vouching for one another, and so the network grows. It's an interesting case study, but it seems that proof generation on device-side data is the most scalable option. Yes?
There is also a fourth approach that is worth mentioning, because we've had a few discussions also this morning when we were talking about ZK passports and the like. So the problem is that with generative AI, all of the biometric and activity-based verification of humanity is somewhat vulnerable. So we've seen this also already by security agencies in Europe that, for example, image or video identification that is based on AI is basically being ruled out as unsecure in the health sector. And so I believe we should rather look into digital identities issued by governments that are based on cryptography natively, like for instance digital ID cards which have a crypto chip which can generate digital signatures, And this has the huge benefit that, as opposed to, for example, the orb, you don't only get a proof of uniqueness that basically you can use for airdrops and the like, but also that at the time where you generate the signature, there is a lot of evidence that it's still the original owner. Because, for instance, so I've been in touch with the European Central Bank talking about like private payment systems, and their major concern is that even if you implement a system with limits, like turnover limit of €1,000 a month, that there could be a black market for unique identities. So you basically pay 100 people in the poorer country to register with the orb, ask them to give you their secret keys, and then you have access to 100 accounts and you can circumvent all of those reasonable limits that you would impose. And if you anchor this instead to a government-issued ID, this has the advantage that it is now suddenly not an isolated means of authentication, but that giving somebody else access to your ID card also excludes you from using the ID card in other contexts and makes you vulnerable to abuses of the ID card for, I don't know, any other crime that you can do in their name. And so this all or nothing transferability is very helpful, because the more privacy you have, the higher the guarantees need to be that this identity was not shared or sold or whatever on the black market.
Totally. So actually, I'll spotlight these two projects at the end. I would love for you to be in touch with the team at Holonym that's doing exactly that. They've been working actually with Bitcoin, and also they've been in talks with regulators because they care about basically secure first on-chain voting, but then eventually off-chain voting. They're doing exactly that when it comes to generating proofs based on existing passports and IDs that have chips and biometric data in them. That I would say, though, they consider that to be proof generation on device-side data, because the passport credential and that data has to live on your phone for it to be compliant, either on your phone or on a government device. Otherwise, you're liable for giving that data out and potentially somebody impersonating you. So, like, a compromise that's kind of being struck right now is, okay, your passport lives on your phone, we can generate proofs of it, but no one else, physically and so on. But I'm so glad that the European Central Bank is onto this, because actually some of the stories are harrowing about the people running around.
I think we shouldn't overestimate that. So some people are interested. It's not like
it's not an all or nothing.
In the bank, so they are still stuck with the anonymity vouchers, which is the lowest privacy guarantees you can get.
Sure. All right, guys. So, just like a little exercise, right? You're working with personal device, an encrypted centralized database of blockchain. Turn to your neighbors and collaborate in small groups to develop a prototype privacy-preserving application using ZKPs. So identify a practical use case, like just throw something out there, healthcare data sharing, financial transactions. Design an application architecture that incorporates ZKP for data protection. So that it doesn't have to be really robust, but maybe it can be generating proofs on an encrypted centralized database of healthcare data. And validate the application's compliance with relevant regulatory requirements. So ideally you guys would do this exercise now, or just throw out some ideas that have been maybe stewing in your head as the presentation's gone on. But I think it's also a relatively good framework to think about building and developing privacy protocols, right? Regulation should be baked in, and you should be thinking about personal devices, encrypted centralized databases, blockchain nodes as falling under, different jurisprudences. Okay, so does anyone have any ideas?
I mean, I would think with healthcare regulations, especially as they stand now, data is very much so all or nothing. It's, I mean, kind of a little bit in the Stone Age is nice that there's privacy, but also the mechanisms are not modern at all. And so especially with ZKPs or just a lot of any cryptographic magic, you can tailor, what am I trying to say? You can tailor the use or the disclosure of the data to what's actually needed rather than kind of like all or nothing, like especially if you're sharing it in the US between medical institutions, again, all or nothing. If you're trying to convince a doctor that you have or don't have something, it's not just that, it's your entire history and a bunch of extra things that go along with it, which is why everything with HIPAA is mostly all or nothing. And I would assume that with this, you can have actually like much better health care because you don't need to disclose so much information.
Question to that, but where would that healthcare data live in this case?
Primary care provider.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, like you do trust your doctor. Like there is that one thing. The point of HIPAA isn't to like keep your health data from your doctor, but it's to keep your doctor or someone else from leaking it or just doing things that you don't consent to. So yeah.
Yeah. May I ask? So what I don't understand in the health sector is where the verifiability is needed. So if I don't need to check the correctness of the data, then we don't need ZKPs. So the question would be basically where in today's interaction in the medical sector does, for example, a doctor really need to prove that a statement about a more detailed record they made in the past, that they now reveal a subset of that? Because today I would expect that an insurance will just believe what the doctor says. They don't need verifiability that this is derived from, I don't know, a digitally signed statement by this very same doctor.
I mean, maybe I don't understand the nuance of the question specifically, but I would assume that there's always medical fraud going on somewhere in the world, so verifiability is always needed, period.
So I was wondering basically in which scenarios do you have, is the prover different from the attester? Because if the prover is the attester, then it's somewhat meaningless because then they can just sign a new statement with a subset of the claims and you don't need a ZKP, you just send whatever you want to send.
I wouldn't be completely sure off the top of my head, so maybe some kind of partition between the doctor and the institution that the doctor's with or something who's around. I'm not by no means am I any kind of expert on the healthcare infrastructure, but yeah, I don't know.
Because I'm sometimes confused, so there are scientific papers being written about users now suddenly proving the correctness of their history of, I don't know, illnesses, and I was wondering, so what would be the incentive for the user to cheat when they give this to a hospital that treats them?
Yeah, I guess before you go real quick, because it just back to what you said, I mean, maybe it can also give people provenance over their own data. What the original statement's coming from the doctor, and you can prove that, like, hey, or attest to what the doctor said.
There's one use case I came across whereby this hospital was trying to assess how good an image classification software was. So on the one hand, the hospital doesn't want to hand over like private lung x-rays. But on the other hand, the modeling company doesn't want to hand over their proprietary model. And so this is so this use case is like try before you buy, which allows the hospital to like compute on private data without handing it over. But this isn't done with ZKPs as we're familiar with. It's done with the interactive zero knowledge. So that's one possible use case.
I've got an interesting use case, not related to healthcare, but just something that's in my field a little bit. So we've been building some sort of it's related to compliant, but more just a zero knowledge representation of an entity's balance sheet. And you can kind of imagine these big exchanges and custodians and ETFs naturally have a lot of inflows and outflows on them. And in many cases, some of the reporting requirements around them are pretty standardized in the traditional space, but it doesn't really so much apply in the if you want a DeFi, if you're using a DeFi protocol, or if you're in a kind of the more digital native side. So we've been building out this protocol out with a little bit of help from Coinbase, where basically you can construct a zero knowledge representation of that balance sheet, the nature of the assets, the time horizons on certain kind of liabilities on that asset, as well as any transactions coming in and out. We're now at the stage where we can actually, we're very close, but build it out on a per block basis. So if the minute some sort of transaction happens that flags one of these compliance flags, you can imagine it being an AML KYC flag, that can kind of be triggered immediately. The issue that we're seeing now is that almost every single one of the big custodians are very keen on this concept and really want to work with it, but they'll only really pull the trigger when there's a requirement from a regulator. So one of the areas that we've been kind of keen to discuss more kind of openly on a regulator roadshow is how do we actually build this out so much so that a regulator would actually be interested in it, and we kind of think that that'll take many more years, even though they're building Uniswap bots. They're going to take a while before they kind of understand the nuances and how that works.
Yeah, guys, we're almost we're at time, so we're wrapping up. Future directions. What I wanted to touch on is look, actually there's more regulations coming. Verifiable compliance with data regulations during inference for AI and ML models, fully homomorphic encryption. Depending on regulatory approval, relative versus absolute approach can be very promising for suddenly saying, actually, we're not storing personal information, we're storing these completely indecipherable polynomials. And there's a lot of international catch-up happening with stringent regulations, so the time for that is now, right? We have the AI Act and security of processing. Article 32 of GDPR ties in quite nicely with FHE. Conclusion. Regulation is coming. Let's see where we can work with it. Some projects of note that have really been handling this head-on, Holonym, ZKPs. I would definitely look into them for identity-related cutting-edge zero-knowledge implementations. And that is all. That is all for today. Thank you. Sorry, my voice is giving out.